All right, so today we're going to be talking about using JavaScript with our HTML document. So this is the key for being a front-end web developer. You're going to have to also, create web pages, but also create some logic that makes your web pages more interactive. First, let's go through our example here. So we introduced this analogy a couple days ago. So HTML is basically the structure that you're giving to your web pages. In this case, would be like the bare bones. Your browser will actually take that structure and put some nice, wrapping around it. In this case, putting skin around it, giving you a nice body. And then we've been using CSS to not have something that's just like completely naked. Obviously, you can get away with that, but again, in society, if you step out naked, usually people will throw stuff at you. Same thing. If you have a website that's not styled, well, they're probably gonna, rip you apart. So, usually you want to put some clothes on, put some nice styling to make your website, appealing visually, so that people don't hate your site and stop using it. So we cover the first, HTML and CSS. Again, the browser is not something we're creating; that's something we're just using. But the last piece of the puzzle is JavaScript. So again, this is the brains of our operation. So far with HTML and CSS, we're able to create content and display content. Again, there's not much interactivity with users. And that's what JavaScript is actually going to allow us to do here. All right. So, so far as we detailed, we're creating static web pages using HTML and CSS. Now we want to make them dynamic, as in responsive to user input, some user actions. That's what JavaScript allows us to do here. All right, so we should be able to manipulate the HTML structure without reloading the page. That's the key thing here. Obviously, we could make some changes on the back end, ask the user to reload. That's not a good user experience. We want to make this dynamic. All right, so the key question here is how does JavaScript actually interact with your HTML document, right? There's no magic that kind of just, there's nothing that JavaScript can do to say, hey, I know you have a web page out there. I'm going to go, respond to it somehow. There is some method to the madness. So HTML is a markup language used to create web documents, whereas JavaScript is a programming language used to interact with logical objects, right? These are two different things. As we said, HTML is not a programming language. So, these two pieces are asking, how do we communicate with each other? The answer to that question is something called the DOM. So the DOM is something that sits sort of between your HTML document and your JavaScript logic. The DOM is going to be your buddy here. What is the DOM? So the DOM stands for Document Object Model. This is something we're going to be dealing with a lot. The DOM is something that's created by your browser. It's a representation of your HTML document. So again, when we write an HTML document, it's just a document. There's nothing fancy about it. It's essentially a glorified text file. But your browser will take that and create an object-oriented representation of your HTML document. Again, OOP, we talked about that extensively for the past couple of weeks. We're not going to be dealing with it too much here, but just understand that's what the DOM is. It's creating objects from your HTML document. So when you have, like, for example, a div, it's going to create a div object that has properties and might have child elements within it. That's going to be represented in the DOM in an OOP manner. The DOM is a tree structure that contains nodes, and each node is an element in your HTML document. So again, this is a hierarchical structure. So you're going to have at the very top is going to be your root node. Then you're going to have your HTML node, and within that you'll have your body and your head, or your head and your body, and your body's going to have a lot more nested elements within it. And the reason the DOM exists is so that we developers can interact with a web page and provide some logic, again, brains behind the operation. All right, the last thing I just want to repeat, it's created by a browser, so this is nothing that you need to do. There's nothing extra that you need to do here. The browser does all the hard work for you to create this DOM so that we could actually manipulate it. All right, so here's like a visual example of what the DOM kind of looks like. Again, it's a tree structure. So at the very top, you have your document. Your root element's going to be the HTML element that always starts and ends your HTML document. And then again, it's going to be nested. So you're going to have child nodes. Within that, you might have more child nodes and so forth. Again, this tree can get very complicated, even for a simple web page. All right, so just keep in mind there's a hierarchy. Again, you have a parent, you have children, relationship there. Okay, so how do we actually include JavaScript in the HTML document? So there are two ways to go about this. Actually, I guess three ways. Similar to CSS, you could do this inline, you could do this internally to your HTML document, or you could do this externally. 95% of the time, you're gonna want to create an external stuff or script, JavaScript file. You can do it internally, but not recommended, I would say. Similar to CSS, again, if you create it externally, that allows you to reuse it across multiple web pages. Versus if you have it just internally, it's going to be kind of limited to how much you reuse that code. All right. So internal scripts, the way you would have an internal script is basically in your head section, you'd use the script tag. So open and close script tag. In between here, where I have this comment, you can write actual JavaScript code. So it's gonna be JavaScript syntax. It's not anything HTML related. It's just raw JavaScript, and it'll do whatever you need it to do. Externally, you need to link to it. So it's very similar to how we link to a CSS file. We still use a script tag for JavaScript. We provided a source, similar to how like an image tag has a source. And we point it to our JavaScript file. There's a keyword here, defer. That's something you're going to want to use if you choose to load your JavaScript in this manner. So this defer keyword will say wait for the entire document to be loaded by your browser and only then load this JavaScript. The reason this is important is, again, because your JavaScript may and usually will rely on the document object model, also known as DOM. Let's go to a sample web page if I can. All right, I'm going to create a web page here. Let's call it dom.html. Probably not a great name. Let me just call it index. This index is usually the default. All right, so with index.html, I'm going to create a bare bones HTML page. All right, so again, we have our HTML tag at the very top, head section, body section. All right, so I have a CSS file that I'm linking to that doesn't exist. That's fine. In this case, I've included an external link to something called script.js, which currently does not exist. Let me create that, scripts.js. That's going to be my JavaScript project. All right, now that I have that, anything I put into my JavaScript file will be known by my HTML file here. But again, I want the way the browser loads your file, it goes top down. So it's going to start with this line, then this line, and kind of build downward. So if I get to this line and I don't have the defer keyword, what's going to happen is I'm going to automatically load my JavaScript here, but none of this stuff down here in my body is going to be rendered. So my DOM's not going to have, it's not going to have this nav element or this main element, and I might need that in my JavaScript file. So I'll likely get an error, or it being JavaScript, no error might pop up, but it's not going to do exactly what I want because it can't reference these objects just yet. So this defer keyword says, wait for everything to load and only then load the JavaScript. Right? Alternatively, and this is not what I recommend, you can take the script tag and put it at the very bottom of your body. So again, it'll load things in order. It'll load all of this stuff, and then it get down to the very last line of your body and say, okay, load your JavaScript now. So in this case, you don't need a defer keyword. All right, but I do not prefer that. I don't recommend that. I like having this up in the head section. So again, scripts, source, point to your JavaScript file, use a defer keyword to say only load it after the entire document loads, and then close off your script.
Hey, Akbar?
Yep.
Is there any reason for that besides personal preference?
To put it up here, yeah, I'm going to say personal preference there.
Okay.
Yep. Again, my head section, I view that as everything that the user doesn't see. So again, the user's not going to see your script. They're not going to see your CSS file. Again, the title is kind of special. But the head section, in my mind or my head, that's kind of just stuff that is behind the scenes. So that's why I like putting it here. Different developers might have different preferences. So I guess you can kind of query professional developers and see what they say. But for my money, I'm going to say use the head section to put your script in here.
I just didn't know if there was a functional difference. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's going to behave the same. But again, the defer keyword is the key thing that's going to let it behave the same. Okay, so that's how we include external JavaScript file. All right, and then kind of the main magic here are some built-in methods that allow you to access the DOM from your JavaScript. So again, the DOM is a object-oriented representation of your HTML document. It is not actually directly your HTML document, but it interacts with your document. So there's something called the document object. This is something that already exists. That's essentially your DOM. And then we have methods we could use. So get element by ID, get element by class name, get element by tag name. These allow you to actually access items from your HTML document. Again, that's modeled in your DOM. So get element by ID, if you didn't guess already, we'll look for something with an ID name and then grab you the like the OOP instance of that element. So again, if I have something called nav bar, I would type in the actual name, and in my HTML file, I would have an element with an ID of nav bar. So let's actually go about doing this. So if I go back to my code, I do have a nav item here. Let me get rid of some extraneous stuff. Let's go with a little stripped down version. So here I'm just going to create a div. And this I'm going to give it an ID. Let's say ID will be main content. All right, so now that I give it an ID, this will allow my JavaScript file to find this particular element. It is possible to kind of navigate the tree manually and go start at HTML, find its child, find its sibling, and kind of find it that way. But it's a little more tedious. So it's much more easier on you as a developer to target items by ID. All right, so if I actually want to reference this, I can create a method. So we'll do window.onload. This is.
So Ankur,
Yep.
would it be a good idea to have all divs have an ID associated with them?
Yeah, so this is a question similar to what was asked yesterday. I don't necessarily give every element an ID. I do that as needed. So in our LinkedIn example, I was giving IDs basically to everything because I need to control properties for every div. But my personal recommendation, I don't give IDs to everything. But given that I don't have a lot of professional web development expertise, so I defer to maybe Tom or someone else, and they might have a better stance on that if you need to give IDs to everything. In this case, I'll only give IDs to things that I specifically need to target. So there's this onload method. Again, this is something that's baked in, and a lot of the frustration as a new developer is like, how do you know this exists? And the answer to that is documentation. So if you want to do a quick Google, let's go to window onload HTML. Onload events. All right, execute JavaScript immediately after the page is loaded. Not quite what I want. Let's see. Let's check for window onload. All right, we'll go to this. All right, so window onload is a function that you can create, and they'll automatically be called when your window loads. So that's hence the name onload. So take a look at this. They have some scripts. All right. The load event fires at the end of the document loading process. So whenever the document completes loading, onload will be called on your window. So that is what I'm defining here. I'm going to create a function to fire when this document loads. So it's going to be the first thing that happens when the document loads. So window onload, let's say we want to do something with this object I created. All right, so I have div ID main content. If I actually want to reference or get an object representation of this, I'll use document. Again, document is a pre-built object, not something you need to define, not something you need to import. It just exists. Just kind of understand that. Document references the DOM. So I could do get element by ID, and I'm going to pass it the name. The name is directly what you see in your HTML file. You don't need to add a hashtag. Again, it's looking for an ID attribute and going to get the value, match the value of it. So in this case, main content is my ID. So I'll do main content. This is going to give me something back. So I actually need to store this in a variable if I want to use it later. So I'll do let's say main div equal document get element by ID. So it's going to look for something and give me an object back for it. good practice is always to check to make sure you got something back. So if I do something like main div, this if statement, especially checking to make sure this is not null or not undefined. So if I actually got something back, I could do something with it. So let's say main div, let's say I want to change the inner HTML. I can set that to today is Wednesday. All right, so inner HTML is a property of this element. That's essentially the content that goes here. So let's say I have something here. I like donuts, right? This is the content. This is the inner HTML for this div. All right, so first I'm going to get rid of this and let's see what our web page looks like right as is. So let me fire this up, index.html. I'm going to use my live server. There we go. I like donuts. That is a true statement. Okay, so this is what our HTML page looks like. Nothing too fancy. What if I want to change this? Well, I could change this with JavaScript by doing what I had before. So I'm going to paste back the code. So again, what this is going to happen, once the document loads, it's going to try to find something with the ID of main content. If it finds it, it's going to change the inner HTML to be today is Wednesday, exclamation. All right, so what should happen is when this document loads, I like donuts will be the initial value there. However, this will happen after, so the text should change to today is Wednesday if I've done everything correctly. Hopefully I linked to my file correctly, scripts.js. Oops, I do have a typo, so that was not gonna work. Scripts, plural, is what I named it. Okay, so again, I'm linking to it. I guess I am reading things incorrectly, that is singular. So script.js is what I'm linking to. And if everything works correctly, notice that says today is Wednesday. So I reload the page. It's always today is Wednesday because that happens after the document loads. So this was a simple example of how JavaScript can actually access things in your HTML document using the DOM. That's what the document here is. So get element by ID will let you target that. You get an object back or an instance of that, and then you get to modify properties. Cool. So there's a few functions, handy functions you can probably using a lot. So get element by ID, as noted, that'll target an ID name. You can also target elements plural by class name. So we talked about applying a class of multiple elements. Let's say I gave a class of like, padded box, for example, from LinkedIn, from our LinkedIn challenge. We want to get every single element that is of type padded box. I'd use get elements by class name and pass in the class name. That would give me an array of elements, right? Because I could have multiple. Let's try doing an example of that. So go here. Obviously, we're going to add some items here. So let's add some divs here. Maybe div 1, div 2, and div 3. All right. All these are going to have the same class. So class of color box. Actually, I'm going to rename the third one. This will be other box. Okay, so we have 3 divs here. 2 of them have the class of color box. I'm going to create a style sheet now. Let's call it styles.css to match the link that I'm doing. And then let's add color box. This is a class. So we do dots, color box. Let's give that a background color. Background color, let's find a nice unique color. Let's go with light coral. That's a cool color. And then let's put in some content here. Oops. Nope. All right, so we want first, second, color. And this is other box. Third box. Okay, let's take a look at our web page now. What happened there? Color. Okay, not sure what I screwed up here. Anyone see anything off?
I think your script is still changing it, right?
Yeah, but I added some more divs here. Oh, yes. Thank you, Brandon. So inner HTML, this is the entire inner HTML for this main content. So Brandon is correct in identifying that. When I said inner HTML, this is replacing everything I've highlighted here. It's not, picking out just one line. So that is something I will need to change. Let's actually change this to paragraph. Let's make that ID heading. And then we'll put the I like donuts in there. All right, so we don't want to change all of that. I want to change heading now. So I'm going to go back to my script. Let's change this to heading. And it should work the same way. But now that I've changed it, I have this paragraph that has an ID of heading. So this stuff won't be replaced when I change inner HTML of this paragraph. All right, there we go. So we get today is Wednesday. That is my paragraph heading. But then I have 3 divs. I have first, second, and third. Notice that third does not have a color because that is other box. It is not of type color box. But now that we have this class called color box, we should be able to access it via our JavaScript. So I go back to my script.js. Let me add another line here. Let's say let's color divs. Again, this could be an array, so maybe name it array. I'm going to do documents. Got a little too autofill happy there. Document. Again, I'm going to do get elements by class name. Again, this is plural. Don't forget that S, very easy to forget. Get element is singular, because as we talked about yesterday, you should never have the same ID used in the same document twice. Every ID should be unique within a document, but class names obviously can be applied to multiple elements. So let's say our class name was color box. And then also I want to check if color divs. All right, let's say we want to change something about everything with this class, right? So assuming we have an array, we need to loop over it. Hopefully we didn't forget our for loops in JavaScript. So I'm going to do for let I in let I equals 0. I guess there's a couple ways we do this. We do let elements in color div array. So again, elements is going to be an instance of that element. In this case, there's going to be divs.
It's of Anchor. It's of color div array.
Thank you. So LM, let's say we want to set the style. So there should be a way for us to set the style. Style equals, and I might need to look this up because it gets a little weird, but let's do background color equals red. Again, I might need to look this up, but let's see if that changes it. All right,
What's
there we
the conditional statement actually checking for? And that's
Yep, great question. So I add these in. I recommend this because there's no guarantee that whatever I'm searching for exists in my document, right? Let's say I'm using this across multiple web pages. One of my web pages might have a heading, something called heading, right? And in this case, I have index and I have something called heading. So it's going to find this element. In this case, it's a paragraph element. Again, I don't really care what type it is at this point, but there's no guarantee that this exists, right? Maybe I'd never use color box, whatever. So if you do an if statement like this, basically it's checking, is this a non-null item? So if you want to check this, what if I add heading blah, right? There's nothing called heading blah in my file right now. So if I run this, it should not execute this, but let's say else, I'm going to introduce a new function here called alert. And this alert is actually going to pop up a box on your window. So I could say elements not found, right? So in this case, if it's found, it's going to get into this if statement and do whatever it needs to do. Otherwise, if main div is something that's null or undefined, it's going to get into this else. So let's see what happens with that. Notice I got a pop-up. So I refresh. It said element not found. That's this alert function. Again, that's pre-built into your browser, and you could use that automatically with JavaScript. You don't need to import anything. You don't need to define an alert function. Your browser has some functionality built into it. So normally, we've been running our JavaScript application through something called Node. Node is something terminal-based, but your browser is what's replacing Node. Your browser can process JavaScript also, but in addition to what Node offers, your browser has window functionality. So it has some UI capabilities like alerts, or there's also inputs. if you actually want to debug this, so I know we've not done this a lot, but I'm a huge fan of debugging. So we can actually put a breakpoint in here and run this and have this breakpoint hit. So let's actually do that because again, I wish we were doing this more. I want you to be using the VS Code debugger because it's really good to use. So I'm gonna go to start debugging. I'm gonna launch it in Chrome. Yes, sorry, I want to launch my HTML file, not my JavaScript. So I did that incorrectly. I get rid of my launch.json. It's important you want to be on your HTML file, even though the breakpoint is in my JavaScript file. So HTML file, I want to load that. Start debugging, Chrome. Should pop up a window. All right, notice I hit my breakpoint. So I'm actually debugging my JavaScript as it's running. My window is over here. And I have two windows going here. All right, so it loaded all this somehow, actually. But okay, so my window on load. We can actually investigate the value of main div. Notice that it's null because we don't have something called heading block. I'm actually surprised that, oh, it didn't update anything, sorry. Yeah, so notice it still says I like donuts here. It says first color box is this light, what was it called? Light coral is what we used. Because we've not executed any of this yet. We're stopped on this line right here. So we loaded the page, this function got called. We tried to extract something called heading block. And notice it's null. That's the value that my debugger is telling me, right? Null. that means this if statement is going to fail. It's going to hit this else statement. But if I change this to heading, let's reload this. All right, now I reloaded this. I changed my code to be heading instead of heading block. Notice that main div is a paragraph. It actually has properties. If I collapse all this, we could investigate them. So again, this is an object representation of that element. So there's a line property. There's, I don't know how many properties here. There's some events. We'll talk about that later. But let's look for inner HTML. If I pass it, I think.
Are these all the DOM properties then? Is that what that is?
Yeah, your DOM is again just creating an object representation of your HTML document. All these things here exist for your HTML document. Like each element has an ID, right? So this ID, notice it's heading. So it's a property that I can access through this object. There's also inner HTML. So that's something we manipulated before. Notice it's I like donuts. There's also inner text. I don't offhand know the difference right now between these two. Inner text might be just for paragraphs, but inner HTML is I like donuts. That is what we're actually changing right here, right? So we're taking a current value and just overwriting it what we want. So we, step through this. If I continue, step over. Now this if statement evaluated this to something that was non-null, so that is true. So something that is non-null is a truthy value. So we got into this if statement. We should be able to update this. So notice if I step one more time, notice that the inner HTML actually updated on that object. So what actually happened is we updated the DOM. The DOM is going to update our document for us. So again, the DOM is like that middleman that handles communication between JavaScript and your HTML document. So if I look at my web page right now, again, we're still broken in our code, so we're still stepping through our logic. But notice that this part got updated to today is Wednesday. That changed. This stuff has not changed yet. And I probably should have picked better colors, but this is light coral. It's going to change to red. Let's actually step through it one by one. So I'm going to step once, color div. Let's take a look at what that is. So color div is an HTML collection. So it's not quite an array, but behaves like an array. I might need to read up on HTML collection, but for the most part, just accept it as an array. And notice it has two elements. It has an item at index 0, item at index 1. Both of them are divs, right? So again, each of these divs have properties. I'm not going to go through this list again, but you can, investigate them and manipulate whatever you want to. But now let's go through our for loop. So I'm going to step. We get to our for loop. All right. So notice LM is our first div. We're going to update the background color of that to red. So we're sending a style property. And this is a property that exists for pretty much every element. I'm going to step over that. All right. So notice we went through this loop once. Let's take a look at our page. Notice that the first box is now red because we actually updated only the first box right now. We're still going through our for loop. So we can step more, updated that to red. So now our second box got updated to red. So again, debugging, very useful. I would encourage you guys to get familiar with the VS Code debugger if you've not used it before. Very helpful, especially when you have, again, this is a simple example. When you have, a lot more code, a lot more going on, it's easy to get lost and like stuff might not work. You might be like, well, how do I figure out what's not working? That's where I would highly recommend stepping into your debugger, setting breakpoints, and seeing what values you have in your application versus what you expect them to be. And, that's really helpful for identifying what's going wrong.
Ankur, is there a way to step backwards? Like if you look at something, then you're like, wait a second, and you want to like go in reverse. Is there a button to do that up there in that control bar or no?
I don't have a 100% answer. I believe it's not possible in VS Code. I know if you use something called Visual Studio, which is VS Code is like a light version of it. Visual Studio allows you to move the current access point. So in Visual Studio, I would be able to drag this and move it to like 2 lines above if I want to. I've not figured out how to do that in VS Code. I'm not sure if it's possible. I would say try doing a good Google. Might be possible. Again, VS Code has a lot of features to it, but I don't know offhand how to change the execution point. So I think you're gonna have to reload the document or reload the script if you want to have it execute again.
Thank you. I have another question about the JS, if I may. I don't want to stop you or not, but
No, go for it.
When we're like, so I see we've got on line 3 window on load, and then the rest of our JS code is inside there. And I'm just trying to remember about like how JavaScript works. Like, is all of our code going to be inside that window.onload, or can we just call window.onload, set like, I don't know, the document as an object, and then have other functions that kind of jump in, or is all of our stuff going to live inside that window onload?
Great question. So right now I've put all my JavaScript in onload. And the reason I've done that is because I want all of this to automatically run when the document completes. So the onload method, again, this function is going to get called immediately after your HTML document fully loads. Right. So I'm defining an anonymous function here, and this will get executed once the document loads. I don't have to do this. And we're going to get into an example of, you might not want code to execute right away. We could break this into functions. So let's go through that. Let's say update heading, and this could be a function. And we're going to use anonymous functions a lot, so get familiar with the syntax, also known as fat arrow functions. We could do this logic in there. The document object is accessible throughout your JavaScript file. It's not only limited to your onload method. So if I just call the function update heading, again, remember JavaScript has hoisting, so I can call it here, even though it's defined down here. It's going to work the same, and probably better always to modularize your code. So, I'd argue you probably want to create functions here. So let's say update color boxes. I'll do the same thing there. So yep, functions are the proper way to organize your code. So I'm glad you kind of stressed that. All right, but again, I'm not
sure. You were you were right earlier about the VS Code not having the step back function, but Visual Studios does. But I also wanted to point out, if you're going to leave the code like that, line 17, close bracket should be at the very bottom, I believe, unless I mess this up.
Oh, I think my brackets match up. So this is my onload function, and then this bracket matches this bracket, I think. But again, I could be wrong. Right. So I modified my code. Notice I'm still broken in my code, so it's not going to execute. Like, it's not dynamic, so I can't keep executing this. Like, it thinks it's on this line, it's not really on that line. So I'm going to actually stop, or let me just stop this. All right. So again, breakpoints, debugging, very useful. So I should not have changed any functionality. I just created functions, and I'm calling those functions from my onload. So if I run this again, notice it actually works. We could make another color instead of red. Let's make that cyan. That's a color. There we go. So that works. Okay, well, let's get back to our lecture. So again, by class name, you also by tag name. So tag name would be the type of element. So I could target all paragraphs. Notice this is get elements, again, plural. So if I want to get every paragraph in my document, I can update that by doing tag name. So let's do a quick example of that. Since I have 3 divs, I did it by class name, which is color box. What if I want to target all these divs and update them? Well, I can do that easily with that new function. So let's say update all divs. It's going to be another function, that arrow. It's going to be similar to what I'm doing here. So I'm actually just going to copy and modify to save some time. So it's going to be all div array. Again, instead of using get elements by class name, I'm going to use it get elements by tag name. In this case, the name of the tag is div. So div, this is what tag I'm using here, right? These are all divs. So it's going to target these divs and also this outer div out here. So that's something I might want to be mindful of. Let's get rid of this. Okay, so it's going to target every single div. Doesn't matter what level it's on. It's actually going to cause a problem for me. Okay, we'll deal with it. So I'm getting all divs, and let's loop over them. So I don't want to change the background color. Let's say I want to change the inner. Let's change the foreground color. So I'll do. I guess I can select style instead of background color. I'll change the foreground color to be what's going to stand out. Let's go with what was it? Dark green. Hopefully that's color. I don't know if that's a color, so I'm going to use hexadecimal. So we go 00 AA 00. That should be a dark green. You're going to change the foreground color for every single div versus this going to change it only for color boxes. So the background color only for those two boxes should be changed. All right, I need to update my variable name, all div array. Okay, so again, get elements by tag name. I'm targeting all divs in my document. Right,
Ankur, I have a question.
Yep.
In that file specifically, why don't you have like a const or a let in front of the variable names? I guess I don't understand that.
Where's this?
All of them, line 20, line 30.
I probably should. So I guess I should have these in here.
Oh, okay. I thought it was some kind of advanced arrow function feature that I didn't know about, which is highly likely.
No, you are right. I've been kind of lax on that. It works. Just your browser is able to understand what you're trying to do here. But yeah, you should be using const or let or var. Probably not var, but thank you for pointing that out. So that is my mistake. You want to have those in here. Okay, so I want to call that function updates all divs. Let's see what happens. All right, there we go. So notice that every div got changed to green. The text color got changed to green, but only the background for the first two changed. If I added another header outside of here, let's say paragraph, this is not in a div. So notice that is still black. The default color is black foreground font because this is not in a div. This isn't a div, even though this is a paragraph. As Raphael mentioned, text color properties tend to trickle down. So it looks like that's taking on the green color. Okay, so again, that's an example of get elements by tag ID or tag name. I'm not going to go over the next two, or maybe I should. Sorry. I'll go over these quickly, but there's also
They're the most functional. Definitely do it.
There's query selector and query selector all. This is targeting by CSS selector name. So this is an alternative way to access elements. So again, the first three, we're accessing it through the HTML properties. Query selector and query selector all will give you a single element or an array of elements based on the selector. So if I wanted to update my current code, let's say I want to use query selector. Again, they're both essentially do the same thing, but we can use the query selector. So instead of doing, let's say color box, this is the class name, but if I do query selector, let's do query selector all. In this case, I need to put in the CSS selector name. And this is where you have to include the dots. Because in CSS, right, when you want to target a class, you have to do it by a dot. Right, if I look at my CSS styles, that is what color box is in my CSS file. It's dot color box. So my query selector is going to have that dot in there. Likewise, if I want to do it here, I could use query selector. And then I would need that hashtag here. See if this works. Yep, notice nothing changed here. Even though I don't have this in my CSS styles, like I don't have a slash heading here, right? but my CSS is going to process, like if I did need to target it, it would be hashtag header. So that's what query selector is doing. It knows that it's looking for an ID because of that hashtag.
Does that mean we're able to put like multiple classes inside that query selector, like the same way you can with the CSS? So I could like put a space in that string, like on line 11, or I'm sorry, in your no, I apologize, in your JavaScript file.
Yeah, let's give it a try. So I'm going to modify this and call this color box, and also let's call it blue box. All right, so this has two classes, which I will define. I guess it doesn't matter. I'm not going to define it there. But now that we have two classes, the question here was, well, can we access both classes in this way? Let's see what happens. So if I put this here, blue box. All right, so again, we're chaining classes here. Again, this is with query selector. So if I try that, what will happen? Okay, that didn't seem to do anything. So it changed both of them. That's not what I want. So looks like I have an error somewhere. So this is where debugging comes into play. So let's debug away. Hopefully you guys don't get tired of debugging, because I love debugging. Start debugging. Okay, loads that. Cool. I'm gonna toss this over here. Let's see what's going on, because something's going wrong in my script. I don't actually know what. This is unintended, but let's find out. So I'm going to step into this function. So now we're in update heading. Main div. Looks like main div is something valid, so it's going to update main div's inner HTML. That update. Yep, today is Wednesday, so that looks like that worked. All right, update color boxes. Let's go into there. And then we're using query selector all dot color box dot blue box. Let's see what happens. All right, so it did find something. There's something in here at index 0. So it looks like it worked correctly. Color array div. All right, so it should be setting the style. I'm actually not sure why it's not. All right, so that's cyan. That looks good. Okay, so this does appear to work correctly. So we chained to CSS selectors dot color box dot blue box, and our result was only one object. Notice that it did not include our second div, because that second div does not have both classes here. All right,
Okay.
so that works. Mike, was your question specifically to query selector all, or were you asking about like get elements by class name?
No, that you answered my exact question. I am a little confused. It might just because of my ignorance with CSS. Like if you're in your CSS file and you wanted to target both of those classes, don't you put a space between the things, or do you actually just do dot name and dot name?
Yes. So
okay,
good question.
All right. So that makes perfect sense then. Thank you.
Yeah. So just to tie up that question, yes, if you want to target something that has both classes, you want to do it like this. If you want to do something, if you add a space like this is going to say find something of color box that has a descendant that has blue box in it. So a space says descendants. If you chain them without a space, that means the same thing needs to have both classes. This means find something color box and then some child or grandchild, anything that has blue box within color box, that parent, then target it. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Good questions. Again, CSS syntax, a little tricky. Okay, cool. I'm not going to do the last one. Query selector all, query selector. Again, this returns one single element. This returns a collection or an array. All right, that's a lot of good material. I think we went through our example here. So I think it's a good time to take a break. So we've been going at it. So it's 11:26. It's like a 9-minute break.